The war across the Pacific stretched from 1942 through 1945, unfolding across thousands of miles of island terrain where soldiers faced combat unlike anything they'd trained for back home. The jungle itself became a weapon. Dense undergrowth choked the Pacific Islands, creating a landscape so thick that battles erupted at distances measured in yards rather than the hundreds of meters soldiers expected. 30 yards, sometimes less. In that suffocating vegetation, with visibility measured in arm's lengths, traditional military thinking collapsed. The United States Marine Corps arrived with something no one had fully anticipated: the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Winchester had been making these shotguns for decades, and while the exact numbers of combat deployments remain sketchy in official records, thousands of Model 1897s and Model 1912s found their way into Marine hands throughout the Pacific fight. Roughly 25,000 Model 97s and somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 Model 12s entered military service during the entire Second World War. But here's what matters: the Japanese military had never prepared for this weapon. Their decades of military planning had addressed everything the West might throw at them: British rifles, American machine guns, French mortars, Soviet submachine guns. They'd studied it all, prepared for it all. Shotguns never entered their calculations. To Japanese officers, shotguns were hunting tools, nothing more. Weapons for bringing down birds in autumn fields, not instruments of modern warfare. That miscalculation would haunt them. Japanese military thinking in 1942 rested on a foundation called Seishin, a spiritual power that doctrine held could overcome material disadvantage. It wasn't just propaganda floating through barracks, it was rooted in cold reality. Japan couldn't match America's industrial output. The Americans churned out more steel in a single month than Japan produced in a year. Japan's answer was to make every soldier superior in close combat, to train men so thoroughly in bayonet and hand-to-hand fighting that their skill and spirit would overcome enemy firepower. Night infiltration was the tactic. Japanese soldiers trained relentlessly in these attacks: move under darkness, slip through enemy lines, then close to arm's length, where their superiority in brutal close-quarters fighting would dominate. They'd made this work against Chinese forces. They'd made it work against the British in Malaya. They'd made it work against American defenders in the Philippines. The formula was proven: approach in darkness, infiltrate. Overwhelm at close range, where Japanese soldiers held every advantage. American shotguns broke this entire system in half. At those exact distances where Japanese doctrine promised them victory, a Marine holding a Winchester Model 97 could fire 6 full loads of double-aught buckshot in roughly 2 seconds. The weapon had a feature called slam fire: hold the trigger down and work the pump action and the gun keeps firing. Every shell held 9 or so pellets, each one a different projectile spreading across the target. In dense jungle where you couldn't aim precisely anyway, you couldn't miss. The gun did the work for you. John Browning had designed the Model 1897 back in the 1890s, and Winchester had been refining it for nearly 50 years by the time Marines carried it into the Pacific. The military version came with a 20-inch barrel, a perforated steel heat shield, and a bayonet lug that accepted the M1917 sword bayonet. What made it truly dangerous in combat was what it lacked: a trigger disconnector. Without one, the gun kept firing continuously as long as the trigger was held back, and the pump kept moving. Marines learned to exploit this feature, though trainers warned them about burning through ammunition too quickly and overheating the barrel. By 1943, the Model 1912 had begun replacing the older 97s in Marine units. An engineer named T.C. Johnson had improved Browning's original design with an internal hammer mechanism that prevented accidental discharge. Both weapons stayed in service for the remainder of the war, though procurement records, while showing steady production numbers, never clearly documented how many actually reached the fighting lines. The ammunition mattered just as much as the guns themselves. Standard .00 buckshot rounds carried 9 pellets, each one weighing 53.8 grains and measuring 8.38 millimeters across. At 10 yards, the pattern spread about 10 inches. At 20 yards, roughly 20 inches. At 30 yards, about 30 inches. In jungle combat, where you rarely saw more than 30 yards ahead anyway, That spreading pattern actually helped. You didn't need precision aiming in vegetation so thick you could barely see. The American offensive began in earnest at Guadalcanal, starting in August 1942 and dragging on until February 1943. Marines from the 1st Division landed with various weapons, including shotguns, though nobody bothered writing down exactly how many or where they positioned them. On August 21, 1942, at what the Americans called the Tenoru River but the Japanese knew as Alligator Creek, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki brought 917 men down to attack American positions. Nearly 800 of them died. The records show that Browning M1917 water-cooled machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds did most of that damage. Shotguns received only passing mention, a brief footnote in official reports. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, Marines used shotguns mainly for defending their perimeters and patrolling the jungle trails. Photographs from the period show point men on patrol carrying Winchester shotguns, positioned up front where they'd face ambushes first. But the after-action reports kept hammering the same themes. Machine guns, rifles, and artillery made the real difference. Shotguns barely registered in the official assessment of what won the battle. The jungle itself worked against the shotguns. Standard shotgun shells used paper cases back then, thin cardboard tubes holding the powder and pellets. In the oppressive humidity of the Pacific Islands, those paper cases soaked up moisture like sponges. The cardboard swelled. Once it swelled, the shells wouldn't fit into the gun's chamber anymore. Marines reported that shells actually had to be hammered into place, an obvious impossibility when enemy fire was coming at you from the undergrowth. That humidity problem dogged shotgun users throughout the entire Pacific campaign. It wasn't until March 29, 1945, that the military officially adopted the M19 brass shell, an all-brass case that kept moisture out. Those final months of the war finally gave Marines shotguns that actually worked reliably. Most Pacific War veterans barely mentioned shotguns in their memoirs because for most of the conflict, ammunition problems had made the weapons almost useless. The military established formal shotgun training through Technical Manual TM 9285, published September 21, 1942. The manual covered Winchester Models 97 and 12, Remington Model 11, Stevens Models 520 and 620, and Ithaca Model 37. Marines trained at Camp Pendleton in California, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and Parris Island in South Carolina. Training focused on practical combat use, point security on patrols, rapid responses during night defense, clearing caves and bunkers, guarding prisoners. Marines learned the Model 97 slam fire technique, though instructors cautioned them not to rely too heavily on it because ammunition consumption was brutal and the barrel would overheat. The Marine Corps authorized 306 shotguns per division starting in 1943. These went primarily to military police companies, pioneer battalions, and selected rifle squads for specific assignments. That meant shotguns appeared in every major Marine operation, but represented less than 2% of a division's total small arms inventory. What's striking about the historical record is what the Japanese never did. Japan never filed formal diplomatic protests about American shotgun use. Germany, back in September 1918 during the First World War, had complained bitterly that shotguns violated the Hague Convention. German officers had claimed shotguns caused unnecessary suffering and threatened to execute any captured Americans carrying them. But Japan lodged no such complaints. Japanese military documents captured during and after the war make almost no specific mention of shotguns. Training materials focused on countering American firepower generally, machine guns, artillery, flamethrowers, but never singled out shotguns as requiring special tactical countermeasures. It suggests that while individual Japanese soldiers certainly encountered shotgun fire, the weapons never achieved enough tactical significance to warrant official military attention. Post-war interrogations of captured Japanese officers confirmed this silence. They talked about American material superiority, about overwhelming firepower, about effective combined arms tactics. Shotguns never appeared in these discussions. Japanese officers, however, documented their concerns extensively about American flamethrowers, which did prompt them to develop specific defensive tactics. But shotguns drew no such concern. The New Guinea campaign from 1942 through 1945 tested whether shotguns might be more effective in different terrain. Army divisions, the 32nd and 41st Infantry, requested shotgun allocations based on what Marines had experienced at Guadalcanal. New Guinea's jungle was theoretically perfect shotgun country, visibility sometimes measured in single-digit yards. But the ammunition crisis proved even more severe there than at Guadalcanal. Constant rain, river crossings, and extreme humidity made paper case shells completely unreliable. Units that had specifically requested shotguns often left them behind, relying instead on M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles. The Army's New Guinea experience revealed a hard lesson. Weapons that looked good on the training range didn't always survive contact with jungle reality. Shotguns excelled in exercises and controlled conditions, but tropical warfare exposed critical limitations that brass ammunition wouldn't solve until 1945. As the Pacific War stretched on, Marines developed specific tactical doctrines for where shotguns actually worked. Three roles emerged as particularly valuable: point security during patrols, where designated scouts carried shotguns as lead elements prepared to answer ambushes with immediate devastating firepower. The buckshot spread could suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously, buying time for the patrol to deploy while the point man maintained fire superiority. That required intense training and genuine trust between team members because the shotgunner was operating well forward and alone. Night perimeter defense was another specialized application. Marines positioned shotgunners at likely infiltration points where the spread pattern compensated for poor visibility. The distinctive sound of a pump-action shotgun being cycled served as both warning and psychological deterrent to infiltrators. But limited ammunition capacity meant shotgunners needed immediate rifle support the moment they opened fire. When American forces returned to the Philippines in October 1944, the 6th Army requested substantial shotgun allocations for urban combat in Manila. Marine participation in the Philippines ground campaign remained minimal, mostly artillery and air support. The Army's 37th Infantry Division bore the brunt of the Manila street fighting. After-action reports emphasized flamethrowers and demolition charges as the primary weapons for breaking Japanese strongpoints, though shotguns did appear in some house-to-house operations. Manila's urban combat showed both shotgun strengths and limitations. Room clearing became devastating with shotgun firepower at close range. Japanese defenders, however, quickly learned to barricade themselves in positions that prevented close approach, negating the shotgun advantage. The weapons proved most effective in surprising encounters rather than deliberate assault operations. The Iwo Jima invasion in February 1945 theoretically saw 3 Marine divisions fielding 918 authorized shotguns. The island's volcanic ash, tunnel networks, and fortified positions created combat conditions where shotguns played almost no role. The famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi came after flamethrower and demolition teams had already cleared Japanese positions, not after shotgun assaults. Marines at Iwo Jima primarily used flamethrowers for cave clearing, supported by specialized flame tanks that could project burning fuel 40 yards into cave complexes, far beyond any shotgun's range. Of the 26,000 American casualties at Iwo Jima, no records attribute any of them to failures in shotgun tactics or the absence of shotgun firepower. The M19 brass shells arrived too late to make a difference. Some units got them in late March 1945, after the battle was finished. Marines at Iwo Jima still struggled with swollen paper shells, further limiting shotgun use during one of the war's most intense battles. The Battle of Okinawa, from April through June 1945, represented the culmination of lessons learned across the entire Pacific campaign. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions theoretically fielded 612 authorized shotguns, now supplied with reliable brass ammunition. But Okinawa's character, fought largely in open terrain against prepared defensive positions, offered limited opportunities for shotgun use. The Japanese 32nd Army had adopted defense-in-depth strategy, abandoning the banzai charges of earlier battles. Japanese forces occupied fortified positions along the shoreline, fighting from bunkers and cave systems that kept American infantry at extended ranges where shotguns couldn't effectively respond. In these harsh island conditions, Marine units focused on coordinated tank and infantry movements, with flamethrower tanks moving alongside riflemen to provide support at close range. Shotguns found their purpose primarily in the final push to clear Japanese defenders from fortified positions that had already been captured. Military police also relied on them to manage the enormous flow of civilians being relocated across the islands. Yet these specific uses, important as they were, made up only a tiny part of the larger fighting effort. Despite how thoroughly World War II has been documented, actual accounts of shotguns in combat remain surprisingly hard to find. The Library of Congress Veterans History Collection contains thousands of interviews from Pacific veterans, but mentions of shotgun fighting are sparse and scattered. The National Museum of the Pacific War holds more than 4,000 recorded oral histories, yet detailed stories about shotgun combat are nearly impossible to locate. Eugene Sledge's memoir, With the Old Breed, widely regarded as one of the finest first-hand accounts of Pacific fighting, never discusses shotguns at all, despite his time with a rifle company at Peleliu and Okinawa. Robert Leckey's Helmet for My Pillow similarly contains no shotgun discussion, despite his service with the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal. These are considered among the most detailed and comprehensive memoirs from that war, and their silence on shotguns tells us something important. Shotguns occupied the edges rather than the center of Marine combat experience. The few references that do exist describe shotguns as useful for specific tactical situations, but never as the primary weapons Marines depended on. Those who carried them remember appreciating shotguns for standing watch at night and for sudden jungle ambushes, but they consistently emphasized that rifles, machine guns, and mortars determined who won the battles. This matches what official records show. Shotguns made up less than 2% of the weapons divisions carried. American factories produced substantial quantities of military shotguns during the war. Winchester alone turned out roughly 25,000 Model 97s and between 60,000 and 80,000 Model 12s under military contracts. Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca added thousands more to these numbers. This production capacity showed American industrial power, but it doesn't necessarily mean all those shotguns saw combat. Many ended up in training bases, guard units, and rear area security posts, rather than on the front lines. Military police needed shotguns to handle prisoners and protect supply convoys. Navy ships carried shotguns for boarding operations and security watch. Airfields used them for perimeter defense. These essential but non-combat jobs consumed much of what was produced. The gap between how many shotguns America built and how often they actually appeared in combat accounts suggests something important. While America could manufacture enough shotguns to arm every Marine squad, practical reality worked against it. Ammunition issues, tactical thinking, logistical constraints, and how the Marines actually trained meant most shotguns ended up in supporting roles instead of first-line duty. They functioned as specialized equipment rather than standard infantry weapons. To understand shotguns' real place in Pacific battles, looking at other weapons becomes revealing. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in 1943, shows up in nearly every account of fighting in caves and bunkers. Marines at Iwo Jima burned through 27,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel, with careful records kept of how well it worked. Shotgun ammunition consumption, by contrast, simply doesn't appear in those same reports anywhere. The Browning automatic rifle formed the foundation of every Marine squad's firepower, and it's documented extensively. By 1944, every rifle squad included 3-bar teams, backed by thorough training and clear tactical instructions. Shotguns, despite being officially allowed, never became integrated into doctrine or generated the combat records that bars did. Even the relatively uncommon M1918 Browning machine gun produced more combat stories than shotguns ever did. Veterans describe specific moments when they used the Browning gun, how much ammunition they went through, and what happened tactically. The complete lack of similar shotgun stories indicates their practical combat use remained limited, even though they were officially approved and manufactured in numbers. The gap between what people think happened with shotguns and what the records actually show reflects broader patterns in how World War II got told. Popular entertainment, shaped by movies and sensationalized accounts, has made certain weapons seem more significant than they actually were. Shotguns, with their obvious power and dramatic effect at close quarters, naturally attracted this kind of exaggeration. After the war, films showed Marines blasting through Japanese positions with shotguns, creating images that stuck in people's minds but didn't match what primary sources actually documented. Video games and popular histories repeated these images, making shotguns seem like typical Pacific War weapons, even though real evidence for their widespread use is thin. This myth-making obscures the actual, more ordinary reality of their mostly supporting roles. The mythology serves storytelling purposes, delivering dramatic close-quarters scenes and highlighting technological differences between American and Japanese equipment. Yet historical accuracy demands acknowledging that while shotguns were present and sometimes effective, they never mattered as much as rifles, machine guns, mortars, or flamethrowers when determining how battles turned out. The small number of documented veteran accounts of shotgun use offers genuine insight into their actual purpose. Marines who carried them remember finding them useful for particular situations, but also remember them being awkward to lug around in general fighting. The weight meant carrying fewer shells, and the specialized nature of the weapon meant many preferred rifles for everyday operations. One Marine interviewed in 1985 recalled carrying a Model 97 during the fighting at Guadalcanal. He said it worked well for guard duty at night and for watching jungle paths, but you couldn't hit anything at distance. When real combat started, he wanted a rifle in his hands. This practical assessment captures the weapon's real limitations across different combat situations. Shotguns did their job in specific circumstances, but they couldn't be the primary weapon. Another veteran from the 2nd Marine Division talked about how shotguns were distributed in his unit. Officially, each squad was supposed to get one, but most of the time it sat with the company equipment. It was too specialized for everyday use. That remark shows the difference between what the orders said and what actually happened in practice. Squads had shotguns available, but found rifles more practical for routine operations. In March 1945, the military adopted new brass-cased M19 ammunition, which theoretically fixed the moisture and corrosion problems that had plagued shotguns throughout the entire Pacific campaign. But this improvement came far too late to matter much. By March 1945, Iwo Jima was already secured, and the Okinawa invasion was just weeks away. The fighting in the Philippines had basically wrapped up, and the remaining Pacific battles would rely on tactics already established and proven. The brass ammunition did prove useful later for occupation work and for preparing to invade Japan itself. Military leaders planning for the massive invasion of the Japanese home islands requested more shotguns for urban fighting in Japanese cities. The atomic bombs made that invasion unnecessary, leaving the new ammunition's combat effectiveness largely untested. Later analysis suggested that brass ammunition would have made shotguns much more reliable if it had arrived years earlier. Yet speculation about what might have happened cannot change what actually did. For the majority of the Pacific War, shotguns suffered from serious ammunition problems that severely restricted their practical value in fighting. The fact that Japanese forces never developed specific defensive measures against shotguns provides significant historical meaning. Japanese commanders created detailed responses to various American weapons that had real tactical impact. They built overhead protection against mortars, dug spider holes to stop tanks, and designed reverse slope defenses to counter naval gunfire. The complete absence of specific shotgun countermeasures suggests shotguns never posed the kind of tactical threat that demanded tactical response. Japanese forces adapted throughout the Pacific War by using terrain and building in depth to counter American firepower generally, rather than reacting to specific weapons like shotguns. They moved from coastal defenses to fortifications inland, created networks of tunnels connecting positions, and eventually stopped launching charges against American positions. These changes responded to American destructive power as a whole, rather than particular weapons. Japanese military studies conducted after the war thoroughly examined American tactics and equipment, yet shotguns barely earned a mention. These detailed studies cover American artillery coordination, naval gunfire working with infantry, and how tanks cooperated with riflemen. The complete silence on shotguns in otherwise careful and thorough examinations points to their limited significance in Japanese tactical thinking. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the shotgun story is the complete lack of hard numbers. World War II produced enormous amounts of data: ammunition fired, casualties analyzed, weapon effectiveness studied systematically. Yet no reliable statistics exist that connect shotgun use to enemy killed or tactical success. The Operational Research Section analyzed weapon effectiveness throughout the war, producing careful studies of artillery, mortars, and small arms. Those reports measured hit probabilities, death rates, and how efficiently ammunition was used. No comparable shotgun studies exist in any archive, suggesting combat use never happened in sufficient quantity to produce meaningful numbers. Even rough estimates are missing from the record. Veterans will readily estimate how many rifle rounds they fired, how many grenades they threw, or how many mortar shells went down range. Similar shotgun estimates don't show up in memoirs or interviews. This absence of numbers indicates shotguns stayed on the margins of real combat operations, regardless of what official authorization or unit inventories suggested. Training in Marine camps had been extensive, creating expectations that actual combat didn't match. Marines learned to slam-fire shotguns, practiced shooting scenarios in jungle settings, and qualified with both buckshot and slugs. This training made it seem shotguns would have significant combat roles. But actual combat felt very different from training scenarios. The controlled environment of Camp Pendleton couldn't replicate Guadalcanal's oppressive humidity or the volcanic ash that covered Iwo Jima. Training targets didn't return fire or force engagements at ranges far beyond what close-quarters shotgun training prepared for. The tight-range encounters that training emphasized proved less frequent than anticipated in real combat. This disconnect between training and actual fighting appeared in other areas of Marine preparation as well. Bayonet training took up considerable time, despite bayonet combat remaining rare. Chemical warfare training prepared Marines for gas attacks that never came. Shotgun training similarly readied Marines for situations that rarely developed the way instructors had predicted. The practical challenges of keeping shotgun ammunition supplied created another major obstacle to combat use. Each 12-gauge shell weighed about twice as much as a rifle round while taking up 3 times the space. A Marine could carry 80 rifle cartridges in the same weight and volume that held just 36 shotgun shells. Supply vessels loading ammunition prioritized rifle rounds, machine gun belts, and mortar shells over the specialized shotgun loads. Every case of ammunition aboard crowded landing craft needed justification, and shotgun shells serving limited purposes received lower shipping priority than ammunition for general use. These logistical facts meant that even when shotguns were present and ready, ammunition stock stayed scarce. Veterans remember receiving 1 or 2 boxes of shells that had to cover entire operations. This shortage discouraged using them freely, which further reduced their actual combat impact below what their theoretical presence might have suggested possible. Military strategists believed shotguns held tremendous potential for urban warfare, leading them to request more of these weapons before the intense battles for Manila and Naha City. The tight quarters, close-range fighting, and necessity to clear room after room seemed perfectly suited to shotgun tactics. Yet when urban combat actually unfolded, the reality proved far different from what planners had imagined. Japanese defenders had transformed Manila and Naha into deadly mazes. They positioned their forces to create overlapping fields of fire, fortified their locations behind barricades, and rigged booby traps that kept American forces at distances far beyond effective shotgun range. The raw destructive power that theoretically made shotguns ideal for urban fighting became meaningless when Marines couldn't get close enough to use them. When close-quarters fighting did happen, those who survived it describe relying on hand grenades, Thompson submachine guns, and flamethrowers instead of shotguns. These alternatives delivered comparable firepower at short range while offering greater flexibility in combat. The Thompson's 30-round magazine vastly outmatched the shotgun's 6 rounds, proving its worth during prolonged firefights when ammunition ran low. Shotguns left virtually no impression on how Japanese military leaders thought about warfare, yet they gained outsized importance in American military legend. Stories of Marines clearing Japanese positions with shotguns became legendary, even though historical evidence for such encounters remains thin. This cultural mythology far outweighs what actually happened in combat. The shotgun symbolized American resourcefulness, taking civilian hunting weapons and turning them into military tools without worrying about what European armies considered proper. This image fit perfectly with how Americans saw themselves as practical problem solvers who ignored convention and thought outside established military boxes. The mythology proved useful for propaganda, even if the actual facts were messier. Japanese military tradition emphasized rifles, machine guns, and artillery as the weapons that mattered. Shotguns never fit into how they understood warfare. This cultural blind spot supposedly caught them unprepared, but the evidence suggests their unreadiness came from shotguns having limited actual impact rather than from overlooking a crucial threat. The shotgun story reveals how technology and military thinking don't always align neatly. The guns themselves worked exactly as designed, delivering devastating power at close range, with pellets spreading outward in patterns perfect for jungle fighting. Yet effective use required specific battlefield conditions that rarely occurred in real combat situations. As Marines fought through the Pacific, their tactics changed and evolved, but shotguns never became central to how squads fought. They remained secondary weapons pulled out for particular situations rather than forming the backbone of squad firepower. This lack of integration reflected lessons learned from actual fighting, not any weakness in the weapons themselves. How other guns succeeded in combat showed why shotguns didn't climb the ranks. The Browning automatic rifle became fundamental to Marine squad organization, with detailed plans for how best to deploy it. Flamethrowers transformed how soldiers tackled fortified positions, generating extensive training in their use. Shotguns, despite their theoretical advantages, never sparked this kind of tactical development or doctrinal attention. Supply and maintenance records tell their own revealing story about how much shotguns actually saw combat. Requisition documents, repair logs, and replacement forms show patterns of weapon usage. Rifles and machine guns appear constantly in these records, pointing to heavy battlefield wear. Shotgun parts requests show up far less frequently, suggesting they saw limited combat action. Reports from Marine divisions indicate the same pattern. Rifles and machine guns needed constant repair and maintenance due to the punishment of combat. Shotguns mainly required cleaning to prevent rust and corrosion from storage, not the kind of wear that came from repeated firing in battle. These maintenance patterns paint a picture of shotguns spending most of their time sitting in armories rather than being carried into combat. The ammunition records back up this conclusion. Military units ordered millions of rifle cartridges and hundreds of thousands of machine gun rounds for operations. Shotgun shells, by comparison, were requested in much smaller quantities, often for training exercises rather than actual combat use. These administrative documents support what veterans have described about how little shotguns were actually employed in fighting. Comparing how other nations fought provides useful perspective on American shotgun tactics. British and Australian forces operating in Pacific regions had very few shotguns, instead building their jungle warfare around rifles and submachine guns. They achieved strong combat results without relying on shotguns, suggesting these weapons weren't essential for success in the Pacific theater. Soviet forces fighting across various terrains, from urban areas to open countryside, never incorporated combat shotguns into their arsenal, despite having the industrial capacity to produce them in vast numbers. Chinese soldiers engaged in extended close-quarters combat throughout their struggle against Japan, yet they similarly never adopted shotguns despite desperately needing effective weapons for their circumstances. This broader view suggests shotguns represented one possible approach among many alternatives, not a necessary requirement for effective combat. Different nations achieved comparable battlefield success using different weapon combinations, indicating that shotguns' actual tactical importance remained limited despite America's ability to manufacture them in quantity. After the war ended, military leaders studied which weapons from World War II deserved continued investment for future conflicts. The Army's infantry specialists conducted thorough evaluations to determine what systems warranted further development. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles all received major focus. Shotguns barely warranted consideration, suggesting their World War II performance hadn't impressed enough to justify continued research. The Korean War brought some close-quarters fighting, but Marines there carried M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and carbines rather than shotguns for their patrols and operations. This choice by veterans who had actually fought in the Pacific revealed their honest assessment of shotguns versus what theory promised. Vietnam later saw increased shotgun use, particularly commercial models modified for jungle operations. Yet even in Vietnam's frequent short-range engagements, shotguns remained specialized equipment for pointmen and those clearing tunnels rather than standard weapons every soldier carried. This pattern persists in modern military forces, where shotguns handle specific specialized duties rather than serving as general-purpose combat arms. Examining the complete historical record about Japanese forces facing American shotguns during World War II reveals several clear conclusions. First, Marines carried shotguns throughout their Pacific campaigns, but actually using them in combat remained limited because of ammunition difficulties, tactical situations that prevented their use, and preference for other weapons. The brass ammunition fix that came in March 1945 arrived too late to change any major battles. Second, Japanese commanders never developed specific tactics to counter shotguns because the weapons simply didn't have enough tactical impact to make countering them worthwhile. The total absence of shotgun mentions in Japanese military records, official training documents, and their post-war analyses indicates how marginal shotguns were to how battles actually turned out. Japanese forces adapted their tactics in response to American firepower as a whole, rather than reacting to specific weapons like shotguns. Third, the gap between how many shotguns Marine divisions were authorized to carry and how many actually saw combat use shows the difference between what weapons could theoretically do and what they actually accomplished. Though Marine divisions officially received 306 shotguns each, the majority ended up assigned to guard duties, training exercises, rear area assignments, and similar secondary tasks rather than frontline fighting. Veterans who mention shotguns at all describe them as handy tools for specific situations, not weapons they relied on as their primary fighting arms. Fourth, the widespread popular belief about Pacific War shotguns far exceeds what the actual historical evidence supports. Movies and popular accounts have made shotguns iconic symbols of Pacific combat, despite scarce primary source documentation of them proving decisive in actual fighting. This mythology obscures the more ordinary truth that rifles, machine guns, mortars, and flamethrowers won battles while shotguns occupied smaller specialized roles. The shotgun narrative offers instructive lessons about how armies adopt and adapt to new technology. Technology by itself doesn't guarantee combat advantage. Weapons only become effective when they're incorporated into military doctrine, supported by supply systems, and included in realistic training. Shotguns had appealing characteristics on paper, but they couldn't overcome the real obstacles that prevented their widespread use. The Japanese military's inability to anticipate shotguns ultimately proved irrelevant since shotguns never achieved enough tactical importance to take advantage of this unpreparedness. Japan's lack of preparation reflected a realistic understanding of shotguns' limited significance rather than a serious military miscalculation. The weapons that truly decided Pacific battles, artillery, ship-based gunfire, warplanes, and flamethrowers, received appropriate Japanese attention and counter-planning. America's manufacturing capability to produce thousands of military shotguns demonstrated industrial strength, but producing weapons and successfully deploying them in combat are separate matters. Building guns turned out to be easier than using them effectively in Pacific conditions. This gap between production and actual use shows that industrial capacity alone doesn't automatically create military advantage. The Japanese infantry who encountered American shotguns in World War II teaches us more about how military legends develop than about what actually happened in combat. Shotguns were present and sometimes useful in particular situations, but they never delivered the kind of devastating tactical results that popular stories claim. Japanese forces truly were unprepared for shotguns, though this unpreparedness mattered very little since shotguns contributed only minimally to determining who won battles. The historical documentation, including production figures, military manuals, and official organization tables, confirms shotguns were present in Marine units. However, the lack of detailed combat records, quantified statistics, and specific Japanese countermeasures suggests actual use remained minimal. Those who carried shotguns remember them as practical tools for particular tasks, not game-changing weapons that altered how battles unfolded. The shift to brass ammunition in March 1945 resolved the moisture damage problem, but the timing meant too late to affect significant Pacific operations. By the time ammunition became reliable, the war's outcome had already been decided through island-by-island advances, relying on combined force tactics, overwhelming firepower advantages, and absolute control of the seas, rather than close-quarters shotgun battles. The Japanese military's failure to develop specific responses to shotguns represented sound tactical judgment, not a critical oversight. They rightly concentrated their planning on defeating American weapons that actually mattered: artillery, naval gunfire, military aircraft, and flamethrowers. Shotguns, whatever their theoretical advantages at close range, never became significant enough tactically to require special countermeasures. Contemporary military organizations still use shotguns for specialized purposes like breaching doors, firing non-lethal rounds, and handling particular close-range situations. This narrow modern application mirrors their actual Pacific War use far more accurately than the expanded mythology suggests. They fulfill important but limited functions rather than operating as primary weapons systems. How limited historical fact transforms into widespread popular mythology demonstrates how war narratives take on lives of their own beyond the actual evidence. The compelling image of Marines with shotguns storming Japanese positions satisfies storytelling needs that historical accuracy alone cannot provide. The mythology serves cultural purposes, reinforcing how Americans understand themselves as practical, adaptable, and innovative soldiers, even if the actual historical record tells a less dramatic but more accurate story. Learning what shotguns genuinely accomplished in Pacific War combat demands separating documented fact from accumulated legend. The weapons existed in authorized quantities and occasionally proved useful, yet never achieved the tactical weight that would position them as important elements in popular Pacific War accounts. Japanese soldiers may indeed have been caught off guard by 12-gauge American shotguns in an assault, but this surprise made little difference to battles decided by American firepower superiority, logistical excellence, and coordinated tactics involving multiple weapon types. The genuine history, though less thrilling, proves more instructive. Shotguns functioned as specialized tools for particular tasks, hamstrung by ammunition issues until the final stages of the war, deployed mainly in secondary capacities and never achieving sufficient tactical significance to meaningfully shape Pacific War outcomes. This reality may lack the dramatic power of popular mythology, but it represents the historical truth revealed by careful study of official documents, first-hand soldier accounts, and military records. Ultimately, the historical reality of Japanese forces encountering American shotguns reveals truths about how militaries create legends as much as it reveals anything about actual combat.